Start though. Good morning. Welcome at the second day of the Metropolitan Mobility Conference, the eHUBS conference on building livable and sustainable cities through hubs. Yesterday, of course, we talked about many ways how we can talk about and plan with hubs and build better cities for all of us. We had many experiences, I think, many discussions, many dialogues all out throughout the building. Today will be slightly smaller. This morning we'll have 2 rounds of programming here in Pakhuis on the 5th floor, here in the eIzaal, overlooking het ei, and of course next door in the studio. In the Breakout round 1, which will start in about 15 minutes, we'll talk about getting the business model right. That will be happening here in this venue. And next door, we'll continue with digging into data, how to organize the digital dimension of eHUBs. After the coffee break, which will be from 11:15 to 11:30, we'll continue with Breakout round 2. And then there will be in the eIzaal will be at your service, serving shared mobilities to cities. And next door in the studio will be framework and action plans for shared mobility. Of course, today, finally, as I by accident said yesterday, that we'll have the site visit to the marineterrein also yesterday, but today it's actually going to happen. Diederik will take people along. Downstairs at the entrance, there was a sign-in sheet where people could join Diederik to go to the marineterrein. My name is still Servas, and I'm very happy to have you here today again. And I was wondering, is there someone who would like to reflect on yesterday, lessons learned, new people you've met, perhaps a nice experience you had yesterday evening in Amsterdam, or otherwise? Is there someone who would like to say a new idea, something that I expected or didn't expect? Yeah?
Hi, Servas, thanks. Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed it very much yesterday. There's one thing that I missed, is actually the link to the goals of the 100 climate neutral cities.
In what sense that you would have liked to have that we mentioned the goal of climate neutral cities?
I meant actually that the goal of being climate neutral in 2030 makes it maybe necessary to speed up and to scale up. Okay. And I missed that discussion.
Okay, thank you. Other issues or someone who wants to respond to that? Please take a seat. Go ahead. You can, that's okay. Anyone who has Debbie, I'm looking at you. You were on stage quite a lot yesterday, and you were talking with many people. What did you expect or didn't expect? Or do you recognize what Jeroen is saying about that we should have talked more about the necessity of the change because of climate change?
I agree that we missed the opportunity to talk about urgency, but there was a breakout session where the University of Newcastle talked about the results in reducing CO2 emission. So if there's anyone else who missed it, please talk to the guys from Newcastle. I think there's one there. I'm not sure if Dylan is here. So or read our research papers. And about yesterday, I liked it a lot. There was a good energy. We had some great conversations with a lot of people. You don't really know what to expect, but I think everyone participated in a way I'd like them to participate. So yeah, for me, it's I'm looking forward to this day to learn much more about our project, to tell you more about the things we did, and the months to come to explore more about eHUBs. And I encourage you all to go to the marineterrein, because we've been here, we saw pictures, but we didn't actually get the feeling of being in an eHUB. I got a rehearsal visit with Diederik last week. It's so much fun. Please all go and enjoy the weather.
No, we'll do that. Diederik, please come forward. You can explain about the Diederik Baster from the City of Amsterdam, the guy who will take us along, but also who's been working on eHUBs for quite a long time. Yeah. What are we going to see when we go to the eHUBs on the marineterrein, which is only like 5 minutes walk from here, right?
It's a 5 minutes walk when you walk a bit fast, so we take 10 minutes and enjoy the weather a bit. But what you're going to see there in the hub and the marineterrein, it's essentially it's a buurt hub, so it's the Amsterdam approach of building it's a neighborhood hub, catered to the context of the neighborhood. And the marineterrein is quite a special neighborhood, quite a special place. It's an old naval area, so it's a bit of an atypical hub. So why is it atypical? That's a surprise. That's why you should come to see.
We'll see. You collect people downstairs, right?
Yeah, but I'm not sure when exactly. So there are two different programs, so we need to figure it out. So one on the website, it's with every breakout, there's a site visit, and in the mail you got, it's only at the end of the day.
So it's actually, I think it's supposed to be during every breakout. So now in 10 minutes you have to rush downstairs to take them along. But if there is... Yeah. But if it's not possible, then we change that.
It's possible for me, it's possible.
Okay. You'll downstairs with the reception desk at Pakhuis.
I will wait there to pick everybody up.
Yeah. Perhaps someone from the partners, in Newcastle University, perhaps Leuven, or perhaps the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, or Kempten, or anyone from each city or university connected to the project has something to reflect. You don't have to, but it would be. Well, let's go to the next session, and I'll leave you to it. There you are. Sorry, I didn't understand that.
So I just think that, well, I didn't attend all the sessions, but I think there was not enough talk or discussion about inclusivity and affordability. And if you just look around, there are very few people of color in here. I think it's something to reflect in, actually how we organize, what kind of topics we bring up, and what kind of people we invite,
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Yeah, because the transition, you have to involve people to really transition into that. And we can't make, well, I think we talked about that, especially with Geert, but also later in the panel, in the closing session, about how important it is to take everyone along with the transition so you don't leave people behind. But you're also talking not just with the financial and economical sense of the word diversity, but also in the cultural and other senses of the word diversity. Very good point. Other people who would like to add to that, other complaints, that would be lovely. Then I'll, there.
No, I think it's really a very important point. And from the city of Leuven, we really want to work on it. So in the next phase, we're going to really look at inclusivity, because we think mobility and shared mobility should be for all accessible. So that's really a working point.
Thank you. Yeah, from a personal level, as an Amsterdammer, of course, and I'm sorry to the city government of Amsterdam, the thing that I find problematic with this change is that it's quite easy to just have in the city center all shared mobility options, and then in less dense area or other areas with less affluent people to have less options. And I believe that we shouldn't do it in such a way that people are not able to change with the system in perhaps poorer areas of cities. So it should take everyone along. Thank you for the addition. Other additions, other complaints, other suggestions, other perhaps something you liked of yesterday, or liked of the city, or liked of your own experience you would like to share? Then we'll see you in 5 minutes' time, either here or next door in the studio. So again, in workshop round 1, there is the opportunity downstairs to go along with Diederik to the marineterrein. Again, about 10 minutes walk. Then here in the ISA, we're talking about in the long run getting the business model right. And of course, we talk about in the studio, digging into data, how to organize the digital dimension of eHUBs. See you in 5 minutes. Have a quick coffee. Bye. and for questions and everything else that's needed. My name is still Servas, and I'm still happy that you're here. And next to me is Sven Everson. You're the country manager of the Netherlands and Belgium for Cargoroo, so one of the suppliers of shared mobility.
That's right.
Or rented mobility or shared. What is the correct term? Because some people say, well, I can share my bike with my neighbors, but then there is not an economical gain in part of it. But today we're talking about a business model. But you call yourself still shared mobility, right?
We call ourselves a shared mobility operator. Yeah.
Good. To get that right. And next to you is Elnert Koenigaerts, doctor candidate at the University of Antwerp. Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us today. And you both prepared a presentation. And let's get started. Who would like to go first?
Right.
You, Elnert?
I think I'm going first, yes.
You have the clicker?
Yes.
And for the people, there will be the presentation, and I'll move out of the way so there is no... I can...
Okay. Yeah, so the aim of today was to first present some cases of the pilot cities, how they are cooperating with the providers, how they are trying to get the business model right, also for the providers. I think there might be some overlap with the lessons learned of yesterday of the pilot cities, but we try to focus on, how are they trying to establish a long-standing relationship with the providers. Afterwards, Sven will tell his experience of Cargoroo, how they are trying to get the business model right in certain cities, in certain areas. And then we'll have a discussion with you, how you think that we can establish a long-standing relationship with the providers, because I think one of the aspects that is very important in eHUBs, why people should use the eHUBs is the reliability, is the availability, so you should have the operators also on your side. So let's start with some, case studies of our pilot cities, how they are coping with the operators. First, short introduction, but Sebas already did so. I'm a doctoral candidate at University of Antwerp, Department of Transport and Regional Economics. I'm writing a dissertation topic about analyzing the supply perspective of the shared mobility transition, the current and future landscape of shared mobility services, and the role of mobility hubs in that. And within the eHUBs project, the University of Antwerp was involved in the work package long-term effects. So first, a short description of which shared mobility services were available in the cities, in our pilot cities. We have some, in Amsterdam, we have in eHUBs, we have 3 different kind of cities. Based on the population, we have 2 larger cities, 2 medium-sized cities, and 2 small cities. And this affects, of course, the business model of the eHUBs, but also the business model of the separate operators. But we can first ask ourselves, what is the mobility hub? What is the objective of the mobility hub? If you see, for example, in Amsterdam, they have a mobility hub that contains almost every shared mobility mode. What's the use case of this? Is every operator willing to provide their services at that mobility hub? In Leuven, they are also adding additional services to it, like, for example, the parcel locker. Is there an added value of the parcel locker to the mobility hub? Will it increase the usage of the mobility hub? And is there also a connection with which modes should be provided at that mobility hub? We can also see the broader picture, so which kind of network you want to implement or introduce in your city, what kind of target groups are you after, what kind of use case can that network provide. And I think it's important to really have a real focus on specific target groups, and that your use case or the use case of your network is based upon that. For example, as we see here in Leuven, there's a dense network of eHUBs already. But we see that, the modes they provide at those eHUBs are not really aligned with a objective of the network sometimes. So if you want to really target commuters, it's important to have a back-to-many system to get that first last mile connection. But that could also be difficult for the operator to operate such a system in maybe less dense areas and so on. In Dreux, you only have three eHUBs, which makes the business case, of course, very difficult for the operator. And in Amsterdam, you also have different kind of hubs, hubs that are really targeting the neighborhood, which is because of their bottom-up approach, we see that they're mostly the neighborhood hubs that are established in Amsterdam. So if we go to the case of Leuven, I will skip the first part, but we see that their approach to providers is, they first want to have a service level agreement with them. They try to support them with some investment in infrastructure. I think that's the case for every of the pilot cities, that they support the operators by providing some infrastructure, by looking with them to some potential locations. They also go into dialogue with the operator about how they can subsidize certain trips, maybe also for certain target groups. In Leuven, there was maybe the possibility for the bike sharing to establish a public-private partnership, which could be useful. I think if you also define the use case of that network of bike sharing right, so that you get the right people on the bikes that you want to target. Also, Leuven did some communication efforts in cooperation with the operators, and they are establishing an overall shared mobility framework. In the case of Amsterdam, Amsterdam is a large city, so they are already attractive for mobility providers, which makes it easier for Amsterdam to ask for a certain service level of the operators. They also invest in infrastructure, and the operators, if they want to be part of the mobility hub, they have to sign a framework contract where certain requirements are defined. In Amsterdam, they put a lot of focus on the data sharing requirements, and they try to facilitate the communication between the neighborhood and the providers. And they also are establishing an overall shared mobility framework. In Nijmegen, everyone could enter the eHUBs, so every operator could enter the eHUBs project if certain requirements were met. But there was no financial compensation or no subsidy. So they had because they're a medium-sized city and some areas were not that attractive for the operators, they had some difficulties in getting the business case of the operators right. They provide a large communication campaign, which was very useful, I think, for the operators also. And they are also establishing an overall shared mobility framework, which I think is very good that every city is thinking about how shared mobility should fit into the overall sustainable transportation system of the city. In Manchester, they have their locations mostly at the outskirts, and they had it. They also don't offer any financial compensation for some locations, which is also difficult for some mobility operators to provide vehicles at those locations. What was also particular in the case of Manchester, they introduced a tender process and a suppliers consultation day for their shared cars, and a lot of car clubs were interested, but then still, because they already defined their locations, it was hard to communicate with the operators. Okay, are you willing to provide your vehicles right there? Also, the Manchester is really in contact with, for example, the police. So they're really trying to reduce the cases of vandalism and theft. So they give their word to the operators, and okay, we are really willing to cooperate with you in case of vandalism or theft. And then the cases of Dreux and Kempten were totally different. They had to provide subsidies. They subsidized the whole schemes. They had a bike sharing and a car sharing scheme. In Dreux, the car sharing scheme even shut down already. But I think in these cases, it's important to reflect upon why you should cluster these modes at those locations they want. Maybe it was more useful to have shared cars in that neighborhood and then the shared bikes at the stations and so on. So it's always, you should be aware that the network you want to establish, it's not for every mode the network that is correct or that is useful for the operator's business case. And they also did a lot of communication effort, but still it was difficult to increase the usage so that a business case could be established. So in summary, oops, the points are not there. So in summary, 5 different aspects that the cities have cooperated on with the providers. So first, investments in infrastructure, in charging infrastructure, in readapting their public space. So in that way, they help the operators. Also, some financial compensation. Like, for example, in Leuven, they provided some financial compensation if things were not that good for the business case of the operator. Also some partnership contracts, agreements. The communication efforts were very important in the eHUBs for the city. So they really put a lot of effort in communication. And the operators also gave some did some communication campaigns. So there was a lot of dissemination of the eHUBs. And then, of course, stakeholder management. I think the cities were also playing a big role in that, how they can facilitate interaction between the residents and the providers or between other stakeholders. I think maybe if the business case is not that clear, I think cities also have a big role to play to be a facilitator between employers, for example, who could offer a business case for certain shared mobility modes. Or other stakeholders. And I think that was also a part that some cities were not really trying to do. And their budget is not unlimited, so they had to close, they had to stop some subsidizing schemes. But maybe if looking for other stakeholders could solve this problem also. Well, thank you.
Thank you. A big round of applause. Elnert, thank you for explaining this to us. The thing that comes to mind is it's apparently quite hard to build one consistent model for all these cities. With public transport, there is, of course, within the bigger cities, it's easier to convince public transport operators to operate there. But then governments subsidize in the outskirts or in smaller cities where it's less, feasible to operate. So I can imagine here in Amsterdam there are so many opportunities for shared mobility operators to make a living and to really to get the business case going. But if we, as we talked yesterday and in the opening session, if we want to connect all these areas together, do you think then that there should be a same kind of system as for public transport when it comes to shared mobility? Like a subsidizing scheme to make sure that it's all everywhere available and affordable?
Well, I think if you, as a city, you should first really think about what kind of use case you want to. If you just, in that area where there are not a lot of transportation options, I'll put there the shared bikes and so on. I think then your network should be so dense for shared bikes, for example, that people really use it. Like, for example, for the public bike sharing schemes, as we see in Paris, in Antwerp, they subsidize such kind of scheme because they know, yeah, we can implement, it has to be a dense network, and then it's a viable alternative for commuters and for the private car users. But if you just put one station in that neighborhood and say, okay, here's an alternative, but don't have a dense network, then the use case of that eHUB is very, very low. And so if you define really well for your whole area, what if it's an alternative to your for example, private car use, then you should also know that you have to invest a lot in the density of the network, because otherwise you won't get people for the daily travel to get to the shared bikes, for example. But for a shared cargo bike, it's totally a different use case. That's for replacing car trips to shopping, to go shopping, to visit family or something, or to bring your kids to school. But it's not for your...
And if you look at one of the first slides, you were showing the different uses in the different cities. I can imagine, well, at least I know in the Netherlands, we have more than double the amount of bikes than we have the amount of people. Something the same in Belgium, perhaps a bit less. But in Germany and in France and Britain, it's quite different. So did you also see that in the type of uses for shared bikes, for example, in eHUBs? Was it different in these different countries?
Well, it was difficult to say.
Let's say it in this way, because I, as a Dutch person, I have my own bike, and of course I use my bike to go to the station, and then I use a train to go to another city, and there I use an OV feed, so there I use a shared bike. Is that something you saw back in the numbers? Because then I didn't use it in the city, but I used it in a different city.
Well, I don't think any of the cities really had a use case for commuters, for example. So it was for example, Kempton used the shared bikes wanted to use the shared bikes for tourists. So tourists visiting the city and then have a shared bike available. But I don't know if you have I think if you have an own bike, why would you indeed have a shared bike, for example, network?
If I want to go to Nijmegen, I live in Amsterdam, so I'll bike to the station in Amsterdam, and then in Nijmegen I use the shared bike to bike around the beautiful Nijmegen.
Yeah, but then you have the OV feeds, which is a totally different concept.
So that was not in the project. Okay, now I get it clear.
You want an electric bike?
Is any no, I don't.
No,
but any questions from the audience on this part of it, or can we go? Yeah, to the back first, and then go to you.
Okay. Just wondering, what is the minimum financial subsidy, whatever, that a government should be involved in for something like this to be successful? Because so much of that ends up going away, or lots of pilots, the government, over time says, okay, we only give you money for this amount of time, and then, you're on your own.
Yeah, so I think before people start changing the travel behavior, the reliability on such a network, the reliability of such a network should be really high. So in the beginning, I think the usage will be low, and I think, but if you have the right network in mind and you have the resources for a longer period, I think you should subsidize them for the first couple of years. But that depends, of course, on the use case. If certain operators are already in certain areas operating without a loss for a profit, you don't. Please stop the subsidy. But I think for the whole net, if you look at the whole network and before it becomes a reliable network, I think. But in numbers, I don't know. But I think you should provide some subsidy indeed.
There's a different question here.
Yeah. Thanks, Elnett, for your presentation. The question, or maybe a remark I have, is that I think you're saying, and I hope you're saying, that when you, as a government, I'm from the city of Arnhem, as a government, you need to if you want it to be successful and profitable, then you need to implement the whole network all at once and target the right people and also use a back-to-many system. Is that about the right conclusion?
That depends on the mode. Like for
shared bike, shared e-bike.
I think the most defining use case of shared bikes is indeed to have a back-to-many system, and so that people can bike from one station to the other. But yeah, if you don't really target commuters with that, yeah, if you only target your residents, I think most of your residents will have their own bike. So I think then the network is so then integration with public transport is also very important, of course.
Thank you. Let's continue with Sven, and then let's continue the broader discussion. Sven, you also prepared a presentation, and then I said you are connected with Cargoroo.
Yes, I am.
Suppliers of shared mobility. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Sven Iversen. I'm the country manager Netherlands and Belgium at Cargoroo, which means I'm responsible for the contacts with the municipalities where we have an operation in the Netherlands and Belgium. And I also represent Cargoroo in the eHUBS project. So I'm there today I'm here in that role. I should have used this slide actually during my introduction because then you could see the nice GIF. But so today I wanted to talk about getting the business model right. For Cargoroo, the viability of the business model is closely related to the locations. So locations will be a focus in the presentation. I first want to talk about which neighborhoods are most suitable for cargo bikes. I think this is the most obvious part, so I will not devote too much time about that. Then the second part is where in those neighborhoods that you identify as most suitable for cargo bikes, should you place hubs for cargo bikes? Because the location can be quite specific, and sometimes shifting a location a little bit within a neighborhood can have a tremendous effect of the usage of the cargo bikes in the hub. So I want to talk about that. And then finally, the ways in which we cooperate with municipalities to make our business model viable. So the first part is which neighborhoods of a city do you select or do you begin to place cargo bikes when you start operating maybe? Well, we focus on the neighborhoods where our target group is highly concentrated. This is obvious. The biggest part of our target groups are families with young children. I think this also speaks for itself. Some other smaller parts of our target groups, but still quite noticeable, are small business owners. We do have some contacts with, for example, a bookshop that does their deliveries with the cargo bike. And we now also have one pilot going on in the city of Amsterdam, in the Haarlemmerstraat, which is a super busy shopping street, a lot of car traffic and a lot of bike traffic. The municipality wants to make it autoluw. I don't know how to translate it correctly, but like car shy. I like that. The municipality wants to make it car shy, so you can only have a very limited amount of cars entering the Haarlemmerstraat. And we developed a different kind of box on top of in front of our cargo bike that's really aimed at entrepreneurs for doing deliveries or going to the magazines outside of the Haarlemmerstraat to pick up stuff. This is the first pilot with a different kind of cargo bike, but we really try also to include the small business owners in our business model. And then the last two target groups are career starters and students. I think this also speaks for itself. Students use it mostly to stuff it with beer for parties, to be honest. And then there's the last group, this dog owners. It's a very small group, but they are very enthusiastic about our service always. They always send a lot of pictures to our social marketing team, so we always include them also in our social media, and it's a lovely group to have as clients. Well, the neighborhoods that the target groups are concentrated are the ones that that our business model is most viable. But you also have target areas where the business model works well. This also speaks a little bit for itself, I think. Areas with high parking pressure, this means that people are long on the waiting list to get a parking permit, and a high proportion of the population doesn't have a car. So providing an alternative to the car, which a cargo bike really is, makes sense in those areas. We did a large survey amongst our users in The Hague, which is our longest standing fleet. We are in operation there since 2019. And more than 70, the users there self-reported that in more than 70% of the cases in which they take a Cargoroo, they would have chosen a private car ride if there was no Cargoroo available. So this is really unique amongst shared mobility that you replace such a high proportion of car use. Other forms of shared mobilities might sometimes take a little bit of the modality of walking or public transport, but we really take away car trips within neighborhoods. A second target area that is very interesting, and that was also a little bit of a surprise for us, are the city outskirts. It also makes sense if you think about it twice. We were actually forced by a municipality to place some bikes in a city outskirt. This was the city of Utrecht. They forced us to place some bikes in Leidse Rijn, which is an area very, somewhat farther away from the city center. We thought this is not going to work. Everybody has their own private car in front of their house. There's no parking pressure at all. There's no waiting list for parking permits. But people, of course, use it to go to the city center because there is high parking pressure there, and they sometimes need to go there with their kids or with other stuff. And it turned out to be some of the most high-performing locations in Utrecht. So we're now also a big fan of city outskirts. The third focus area is areas where there is mobility poverty. This is now more and more becoming a theme within many municipalities. There are areas where people either cannot afford a car, or there is not enough public transport, or the public transport is too expensive. And in those cases, also a shared cargo bike can provide an option for people that live in mobility poverty areas. This is a little bit about the methodology for selecting neighborhoods within a city. And then the second question, of course, is, okay, if we identify those neighborhoods, which locations or which spots in the neighborhood work well for cargo bikes? And the first thing I need to explain then is that the use cases of shared cargo bikes are different from the use cases of many other forms of shared mobility. And this has to do with the figure of 70% I mentioned earlier. We replace car trips. And well, what is the different situation between using a cargo bike or using a moped or a bike? You either have cargo with you or you have children with you. Secondly, if you look at the natural behavior of cargo bike trips, so for example, if you have free-floating systems, we see that the entire trip that people make, they make it with the cargo bike. So they don't use the cargo bike to go to the tram stop and then shift their children and their stuff in the tram and make the rest of their trip. No, they make the whole trip with the cargo bike. And they also often, they depart at a certain location, let's call it A, they go to B to pick something up, to drop something off, and they come back to location A again. So it are A to B to A trips, and it's not part of chain mobility, so they don't use the hubs as a transit mode. They use the hubs as the pickup location for their cargo bike. Well, what are the implications of these 3 points for hub locations? The first one, because people have kids or cargo with them, means that they are less willing to make larger distances to the nearest cargo bike. So it's really, really important for us to place the bikes within residential areas, close to our users, close to where they live. The second is, well, hubs don't function as transit locations, as I said, because people make the whole cargo bike trip, their whole trip with the cargo bike. So hubs that are really implemented with the thought of being a transit location, for example, near metro stations or near train stations, are not the most obvious locations for cargo bikes. Many municipalities have this typology, transit hubs, neighborhood hubs, and some third level above the transit hub. And cargo bikes are really most suitable for those neighborhoods hub that are really in residential areas, close to the users. And the third one is not really located as much to the location, but more to our business model. or to our operating model, I should say. Because the trips are often A to B to A, it really makes a lot of sense for cargo bike operating schemes to be back to one. So you have to place the cargo bike back to the same location where you picked it up. This also has the additional benefit that we don't have a relocation operation. And you can imagine with scooters, it's maybe easy to put 50 scooters in a van, but a cargo bike, there don't fit many cargo bikes in a van. So the relocation operation would easily be quite expensive. And without the relocation operation, you can just offer a lower price to end users. So close to our users is really key. I really would like to stress this because I still often have talks with cities that would like to implement hubs, and they really think also for cargo bikes in that transit mode. That is a really standard way of thinking in many municipalities when implementing hubs, and it makes absolutely a lot of sense for many forms of shared mobility, but not always for cargo bikes, because near transit locations, you often don't have many residents living, and we really need to be close to our users. To stress this even more, we did an analysis, and it turned out that 50% of the users of a specific cargo bike location or hub, they live within a 200-meter radius of that location. And another 300-meter radius around the location captures 70% of the users of a cargo bike. Thus even shifting a little bit within a neighborhood can make a huge effect on the usage of a certain hub. This is a small map of the Indische Buurt in Amsterdam-Oost. This is a situation that really happened, a discussion with the city of Amsterdam. We were placing cargo bikes there and we were discussing the locations, and they said, please place a cargo bike near the Muiderpoortstation, which is a train station, a metro station. I believe also some buses stop there. And on this map, it becomes perfectly clear what an impact a little shift has, because we proposed the location on the little square, a little bit more to the north. And if you see the 150-meter radius, you see that it captures a lot of residential houses. If you would have placed it within the Muiderpoortstation, a 150-meter radius captures almost no residential houses. So you just lose a lot of potential users of the cargo bike, again, because they have cargo or children with them, so they prefer not to walk too much. It is true that the locations within those residential neighborhoods are less visible. And often also a way of thinking is we need to make the hubs very visible so people that are on their commute or they're traveling within a city see that the hubs are there, and then they will make use of the transport modalities. Also, this again is a little bit different for cargo bikes than for other forms of shared mobility. In the survey I talked about earlier in The Hague, we also asked our users, okay, how do you know Cargoroo? And what they said was not from seeing a Cargoroo in a hub, but the majority of people knew us because they saw a Cargoroo riding within their neighborhoods, not because it was standing still within a hub. We also did an analysis in The Hague, and we ranked all the locations and we gave them a visibility score. And the visibility was actually negatively correlated with their performance. So we really like the cozy neighborhoods, really within the neighborhood that's actually not very visible from the main roads, but the performance would be higher. Then the third point, the cooperation with cities and municipalities. I think the obvious thing, should I speed up a little bit? Okay. The obvious thing is, of course, co-funding. We have to make huge investments to place the cargo bikes on the street, and reaching a point of break-even is not always easy, especially in neighborhoods where the population density is not very high, or in smaller cities where there are not a lot of people living. We need quite big fleets to make them commercially operational. So for that, we have to be honest, sometimes co-funding is necessary for municipalities. And we would also always like to add that it's not only about providing a way of mobility. We contribute to many other municipal policy goals. And I sum them up a little bit here. We fight congestion because we replace car trips. We make sure that there's less greenhouse gas emissions, that the air within cities is cleaner, that there's less pressure on public space because eventually people might not choose to buy a second car, and they will not choose to buy a private cargo bike. I live in a neighborhood where, unfortunately, we don't have a permit, and I see the number of private cargo bikes really increasing every month on the sidewalk. And lastly, we contribute to more active and healthy mobility and also to more fun mobility, because that's also something that we get a lot of feedback from parents. If the kids can choose between the car or the cargo bike, they always choose the cargo bike, except when it's raining. Thank you.
Thank you. Big round of applause. Yeah, there's a lot to go into, and I tried to log in to make an account on Cargoroo.
Okay.
It took a while to continue that, and I need to record a video with all complicated things, so can't show you that right now. But I'm quite interested to hear what you were talking about and how to connect the city with your cargo bikes and to prevent private car use, like a proper alternative. And for the kids, can't you like make a bit of a roof so it's not open during rainy season? Because it always rains in Amsterdam.
There is indeed a roof that's been developed by our manufacturer, Urban Arrow. We use Urban Arrow cargo bikes. They also have developed a roof, but it's not theft-proof, so we cannot place it on their bikes. We did now develop a theft-proof rain cover. So at least if it rains and you zip it open, everything inside stays dry if you have cargo. And maybe if you're not so nice to your kids will also stay dry if you put them underneath the cover, but that's not the intention.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise that. Any questions, suggestions? People want to contribute? You had a question before the break?
Yeah,
before the... It has already been answered. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm very curious about actually also the survey in The Hague, but maybe we can discuss that in a moment. But about the social inclusion aspects of Cargoroo, or placing, for example, a Cargoroo also in The Hague in areas that are, well, less affluent. Because if I look at the map, it's in The Hague really only in the nicer neighborhoods where I guess a lot of families with children live. But have you thought also about maybe placing a cargo bike in the Schilderswijk in The Hague? Because I'm working with the municipality of The Hague also, looking at Hobbemaplein in a Schilderswijk, Transvaal area. And there's also a lot of families with kids. There's very high parking pressure, huge problems about around that.
I would like to say two things in response. The first one is something I already touched upon, and it's plain and simple, it's also about the financial model behind placing cargo bike somewhere. They're a huge investment to place a single cargo bike, and somewhere we need to reach the point of break even and even become profitable, of course, eventually. And in some neighborhoods, this might mean that we need co-financing from the municipality. But it's not only about that, and it's something I actually also learned from the eHUBS project, and I think it was Loes who once gave a presentation about this. It's not, the financial aspect is only one aspect in many neighborhoods. We are in Amsterdam in the Indische Buurt, which is also a neighborhood with a lot of residents living with a Moroccan background, for example. And we also saw that the cargo bikes were not used as much as in surrounding areas. And Loes also said, even if you take away the financial hurdle, there's still a cultural hurdle within many groups for using cargo bikes, because it really has this image of being for yuppies. So we just looked for...
There's a lot of work to do too.
There's a lot of work to do, and we looked for cooperation with local groups. So we had a cooperation with a local a neighborhood house in the Indische Buurt, and we teach some of those people to take care of cargo bike lessons, because people can also just be afraid in some social groups to use a cargo bike. And they start teaching people to drive the cargo bike, and eventually we didn't even have to show up there anymore because they started to teach each other. The municipality supported it a little bit with vouchers, and now we see that these locations are performing better. So it takes a lot of work, but yeah, we also really would like to make it more inclusive, but we need cooperation with the municipality for that.
Thank you. Elnert, you prepared some questions you would like to discuss, and perhaps you can put it on the screen.
Yes.
Lisanne is behind the computer right now. And we were supposed to go in smaller groups, but this was quite interesting, but it took a long time. So we only have 50 minutes left. But perhaps we can pick a few which you would like to go more into detail on.
Yeah. I would ask. Yeah, I don't know if.
Yeah, maybe the public has a preference for a question or not.
Just read them so everyone can continue. Because so the first one is, which objective would you try to reach with the implementation of eHUBs? That's question number 2. Question number 1. Question number 2 is, which kind of modi would you focus on? Which kind of providers would you need? What are hubs? Clustering and the modes necessary in this case. And the third question is, which obstacles would you foresee to reach the objectives? The fourth question is, how could providers help reducing these obstacles? In which way could you support providers? And the final question is, on which element would be focused on deciding whether the relationship will be extended?
Maybe the last 3 questions.
The last 3 questions. No, but why? Because the thing is, how do you connect providers with hubs in general, and how can you make sure that it's both feasible for providers to offer services there, but also in such a way that it's accessible to the whole population and a true alternative to private car use, right?
Yeah, it depends on what the objectives, the policy objectives of the municipalities are. So, which target groups are they looking after?
Mm-hmm.
And those objectives affects which providers, which modes they need, and that affects, of course, the business case of the providers. If you would, like for example, Cargoroo, they would place their cargo bikes only in the mainly in the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Why would you add to those neighborhoods also, I don't know, a bike sharing or moped sharing scheme to that? What is the objective behind it?
It has to be connected to the people living there and their needs and their use cases.
Yeah, and then you can think about to give support if
yes.
you.
Yeah, and you said the last 3 questions you would like to ask. Which obstacles would you see to reach the objectives? So what obstacles do you foresee by reaching these objectives? Why this question?
Because we saw during the eHUBS project that the pilot cities had a lot of obstacles or bad maybe some bad cooperation with providers. Mm-hmm. Not bad cooperation, but that the cooperation with the providers was not as foreseen, and maybe it's because the thing you want as a community, as a municipality, does not align with what the providers want. So if you could identify which obstacles you will have, maybe the providers can help you and also in that.
To tackle those. Any people from the audience listening to all these stories for today and yesterday, of course, what kind of obstacles do you see, and how do you think we can tackle them? Tracy?
Thank you. So something that's just occurred to me is that Manchester has a status as an age-friendly city, so, you know, very inclusive for older people, for example. I can't ride a bike for all sorts of reasons for my own disabilities, but I'd happily sit in a cargo bike, but I don't have the mobility and the agileness to get in and out of a regular cargo bike like a child would jump in. My dog would happily jump in, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence around and about of adapted cargo bikes that I could easily get in and be a passenger. Now, to encourage our older people to be part of the e-bike community, if you like, I think we would need to see more of that and need more support. So that, for me, as a political leader, would be an obstacle, because we're in danger of contravening our commitments to being an age-friendly and inclusive city.
Thank you. Sven, how do you make sure that people can get into your bikes and everybody can use your bikes, not just, well, the most flexible of us?
I don't exactly know what the needs are of people who cannot get inside the cargo bikes by themselves.
So I've tried this.
Okay.
So the step up to get into the cargo bike is too high. So it's like, a door for an opening to get in at a level rather than having to sort of get your leg over and inside is really difficult for me. I've tried it. It's really hard without people to manhandle you and get you in. So, you know, sort of easier access to get in and sit down, etc.
Yeah, it's to be very honest, this is also the first time I'm thinking about that. To really adjust the bike model and have a door is maybe a bit of a huge path for us to travel. But I could imagine maybe it's also good to include in every cargo bike, because you have a little bench with a net underneath, maybe a little like help to step up, or that, you know, these kinds of ideas are actually very useful for us. And yeah, we haven't thought about that before, but I could see so.
Free of charge. And we don't want to manhandle people, so let's not do that. Any other obstacles that we have to...
I just had the idea about the co-funding from the cities, because we all know that cars are really heavily subsidized. So I think it would be a good idea to also subsidize shared mobility in the same amount or even more, because it's eco-friendly and so on.
In what way are cars heavily subsidized?
Yeah, because if you look at private parking permits, the space that you use for private cars, like if you would pay for it on the free market, it's much more than you pay for the parking permit, for example.
And so you would like a same kind of scheme for eHUBs?
Yeah, just put it in relation that if you subsidize car use, you could also subsidize this shared mobility or the Cargoroo schemes and so on.
Yes, I think in scientific community there's a agreement that the costs of car use should be internalized, also the external costs. So, but that's a political, very difficult political debate. But yeah, indeed, if car use is as costly as it should be, we would definitely see a shift also. And then maybe shared mobility doesn't have to be subsidized.
Yeah, and maybe also to add to that, something I already touched upon a little bit, that I also think it's very useful to take the whole co-financing discussion broader than just mobility. Because placing cargo bikes, like I said, also contributes to many other policy goals of municipalities that they actually spend quite a lot of money on. For example, greenhouse gas emissions, or making the population more active and more healthy. We are now actually, we gave an economic bureau the assignment to calculate how much costs placing a single cargo bike prevents municipalities in other policy areas. So it's also a discussion about shifting budgets within a municipality instead of only having extra expenditure on the cargo bike scheme. You also save money somewhere else.
In my experience, this is also one of the most difficult discussions to try to follow, because same with the hospital, like healthcare costs going down when air quality goes up. It's almost impossible to calculate in a good way, but quite interesting. Thank you. There's another question here.
I guess just to clarify my question earlier, and the subsidy for personal vehicles sort of ties into this, is, you know, the obstacles for finding parking space, for example. Like, that's something where you probably need the government to say, yes, we're going to remove all these spaces for personal vehicles, and we're going to give it to something like a hub. Or as the government, we will promise to help do communications, right, and advertise this system. And those are the types of things that I'm wondering, what do you need? What is the very least that you would need for an eHUB to be successful from the government? Not necessarily we need €3 million, but what are the different sort of support schemes that, and make, you know, plus money, plus funding, but things that aren't pure funding that you would need for it to be, you know, those are the obstacles that I think are really important to think about, and what are, you know, you're only going to be successful if the government helps in, you know, X, Y, and Z. So just thinking about, you know, what those are.
Thanks. Quick response to that, or also very much?
Do you want? I think it's about those 5 aspects I showed during the summary. It's about making investments in the adapting your infrastructure, adapting your public space. It's about also stakeholder management. So, for example, employers are a really good target group. As a government, you should communicate with them and try to get their employees, or to offer their employees an alternative. I think that's where the government could also play a very, very big role in. Also in your partnership with the providers also, and then the communication, of course. I think communication is also key, but then, of course, if it's still too easy to indeed park your car or offer alternatives to shared mobility, like private car use. If it's still too easy, then yeah, communication will.
It's like with the opening session yesterday with the councillors from both Manchester, of course, and Amsterdam. We talked about the carrot and the stick. So it's both options you need to reorganize the transport system. That's what you're saying as well. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of thoughts, really. Where there's a need for subsidy in some public bike share schemes across Europe and in the UK, there is a commercial sponsorship element to that, which can provide some funding. But for example, in Greater Manchester, when we have rolled out our public bike share scheme, it will be 1,500 bikes. That's a kind of scale at which, a commercial entity could be interested. It's maybe a little bit, I'm guessing, a little bit more difficult to get commercial sponsorship for an eHUBS project where there are, say, 3 or 4 locations, even, a dozen locations in a city. So the follow-on from that is has there been any consideration of integrating e-cargo bike hire in a wider general public bike share scheme, or could that provide an option to take advantage of the commercial sponsorship at a larger scale to provide some subsidy?
We don't have any active experience with that, but there have recently been published 2 big tenders, one in the city of Strasbourg and the other city I forgot, in which this was actually a requirement from the city indeed, that cargo bikes are integrated in the shared bike scheme, and we have talks with shared bikes operators to cooperate. But as of currently, we don't have any scheme in operation where this cooperation is in place.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Because we're almost at the end of this session. No? There you are. I'll go with you to the microphone because then people at home can also.
2 more obstacles. So I work for the city of Arnhem. So the first obstacle are my colleagues. the colleagues from mobility, for instance, and who make the policy on parking. And the second obstacle are people in the city who lose or are afraid to lose their parking spot. So people are very anxious about parking in their neighborhood. And if you ask the municipality to give up a parking space to put bikes in, for instance, they will be very upset. So that's so I agree with you that the government needs to be a sort of intermediate between the provider and the people in the city.
But how can the city of Arnhem convince people to give up their parking space?
We try to tell them that when you, for instance, for a shared car, you might lose 5 normal cars, but people usually do not believe that. So what we try to do is find, in every neighborhood, we try to find sort of ambassadors. And especially, again, the rich neighborhoods have those people. And they can tell the other people in the neighborhood that it's really working like that. So that you lose cars when you put in, for instance, bikes or shared cars.
It sounds a bit like a top-down, bottom-up movement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, both. Yeah.
Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I know the difficulty of convincing people or even civil servants indeed, to place a cargo bike in neighborhoods. Yeah, I think it also sometimes just takes a little bit of political courage, and to place a bike somewhere. This pattern is visible everywhere. In the first few months after you place a bike, there might be some residents that complain, but after those 2 months, they are used to the spot like they are used to parking places, and the complaints drop to 0. So I think political courage is the answer here.
In addition to that, I think it's mentioned yesterday in the session about designing public space, people-centered public space. Convincing people to hand in parking permits, really helpful to see what it can do for their own public space in a direct relation with handing in parking permits, designing public space within their own neighborhood for playing, for green, maybe for parking, shared modalities. It's a really good way to convince people and to let them experience what it can do.
Thank you. We're almost at the end of the session, so anyone who wants to say something, raise your hand. I'm going to go to you.
Maybe just the last obstacle that we face in Leuven is the big issue about the salary cars. Many people are, so how do you say it? The leased cars that they get from the company. So they're like wanting to do some efforts, but yeah, and I think that's really something that we should take on a political level with many countries together to fight against that issue.
It's like Sven, I think, said, but also Elner in another way, is we should talk to the employers to really convince or also help or maybe force their employees to travel differently. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I think it should be done on a higher level still, because some employers are ready to do it. But I mean, the tax issue is just making not interesting for the people, so they won't be able to convince their employees. So.
Well, thank you. Yeah, a while back I had a discussion with the people from one of the larger banks here in the Netherlands, and apparently it's quite hard to convince people to get to the train when we have to go to use the train when they have to go to Paris. So a lot of people still fly, even though there's one meeting during the day from Amsterdam to Paris, even though the train is much more comfortable, faster, cleaner. All these things, there's people still. So thank you. Any last words? For today, for this session, not in general.
Well, yeah. What I think, what we got out of this project, or the findings of this project, is it's of course it was a pilot project, so it's difficult to at the first moment establish a network that convinces the target groups you want to target, because the network is too small and not so dense enough. So please, as a city, be aware that you first, that you really well define your target groups and then see which kind of hubs you need, because not every hub need that and that mode, and that way you can also, and indeed your stakeholder management also is very important, I think.
And Sven?
I think personally what I learned most from the project was a lot about locations, and that some locations are more suitable than others. But no location is impossible, but they might have their special needs, and we need to cooperate with municipalities for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elner Koenegaerts, doctoral candidate at the University of Antwerp. When do you plan to finish your candidacy? And can we see the end results?
So yes, the plan is to hand it in next year, April, and then will also be my public defense. But then you have to come to Antwerp.
And then would be amazing. And you're also welcome to come join us here in Amsterdam to talk about later moment. And Sven Everson, also thank you for joining us. I can't ask you this question, of course, but thank you for joining us.
I can offer people a Cargoroo ride in Antwerp when you're coming to see Elner, because we're in operation there then.
I promise when I finish my registration, which you have to make simpler, when I do that, I'll make a Cargoroo ride.
I'll have a talk with the tech team.
Thank you so much for being here for this session. We'll continue with the next breakout round. Of course, in the next breakout round, there still is an opportunity to go with Diederik to the Marineterrein to have a good look at a proper eHUBs. And also there is in the ISO, so here we're going to continue on shared mobility, serving shared mobility to cities. And next door in the studio, we'll continue with frameworks and action plans for shared mobility. At this time, have a good cup of coffee or tea or maybe a cake or a walk. Everything is outside. See you in 15 minutes.